Hey, this is Mr. Spencer, and today we're talking about Mr. William Shakespeare and some of his sonnets and Hamlet. We're going to discuss diction and language. We're going to discuss syntax. We're going to discuss literary devices, multiple levels of meaning, understanding the human condition, and the effort it will take you to study this text. Quick takes on Hamlet. Some critics consider Hamlet as the most intelligent character ever written. You're writing a fiction character. Many consider this Hamlet character the most intellectual and intelligent. Does that mean Shakespeare is the most intellectual writer that's ever lived? I don't know. In the English language, though, he's hard to beat. Now, Hamlet is a character that today we might characterize as having post-traumatic stress disorder. I'm going to put that out there right now, let you chew on that. It is Shakespeare's longest play, so as we read it, there will be scenes we won't be able to read out loud in class, but it's chock full of ideas. One of the most creative minds that ever lived, Mr. Will Shakespeare. And the title character has been played by many famous actors and even actresses. Benedict Cumberbatch, ring any bells? Okay, we're going to be studying a version with Kenneth Branagh, who, in the Harry Potter movies, he played Gilderoy Lockhart. And he directed and starred in the 1996 version of the movie. That's the one I'll be using in class and showing some of the gifs and scenes from on our digital lessons here. Now, let's talk about some of the common beliefs in the Elizabethan period, all right? This is the 1600s. Humans had the potential for development. That's what they believed under Queen Elizabeth here. And the idea of medieval Christianity, that this world is a preparation for eternal life, it was questioned. Instead, people began to see everyday life as meaningful and an opportunity for noble activity. So your everyday life, getting out of bed, going to work, started to become maybe elevated, more noble. All right? Does that mean the lower classes can be just as noble and honorable as the higher classes? What would Queen Elizabeth say? She was a radical, transformative figure in British history, and her influence across Europe and the world is hard to match. So, this was a time for heroes. The ideal Elizabethan man was a courtier, a talented adventurer, a fencer, a poet, a conversationalist. This Renaissance man is what you were expected to be if you were educated and you had the means. And this ideal Elizabethan man, like the title character Hamlet, was supposed to be witty and usually eloquent gentleman who examined his own nature and the causes of his actions. And this was popularized through the story of Hamlet. So the literature influenced the culture. Pretty cool. Marriages were arranged, just like Romeo and Juliet, usually for wealth. Women had a lower social status than men, so we can examine the power and agency of the female characters in this play. And some other common beliefs, people were concerned over the order of things. Remember that Aristotle's great chain of command, the gods, the angels, the man, the women, the slaves, the beasts of burden. In the Elizabethan period, they felt that there was this great chain of being. They copied it from Aristotle in ancient Greece. The concept originated from Plato, and it expressed the idea that there's a proper order within all things. And among all things, based on complexity, the tiniest grains of sand to heaven and God, there was this hierarchy. When everything was in its proper position, there was harmony. When the order was broken, everything was upset and everyone suffered. People felt that their rulers were God's agents, whether they're angels, whether they're kings or queens, divine right, or whether it's the rulers that have taken order, whether they're priests or ministers from the gods above. To kill a king was a heinous crime, and at the beginning of Hamlet, the king is dead. Long live the king! To kill a king was heinous, sacrilegious almost, and the heavens would show ominous signs when such evil was present. So, Aristotle's great chain of command we review there. It's very helpful to remember. That's what they considered power. This view was organic, it was natural, and if you challenged it, you were atheistic, and you might be banished from the community. You are dangerous if you try to argue with this. Do you think our title character of Hamlet, is he going to try to argue with this? Some memes, they thought Shakespeare had no swag. Bro, he invented the word. And if he can't find the words he's looking for, this sucker invented 1,700 of them. He coined so many words that have influenced our English language. Other memes here? Shall I compare thee to a summer's day, girl? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Shakespearean insults are kind of fun here. Pause the video. See if you can preface this with thou. Combine one word from each of the 3 columns and tell your little brother or sister what you think of them. There's no bad words here. Nothing that's a cuss word. Shakespeare was super creative to try to get the high and the low classes entertained by the intellectual ideas hiding in the subtext of his plays. He invented over 1,700 of our common words, and I'm sure you've had an English teacher before share some of these with you. They're pretty funny. I think my favorites are the word bump. I mean, just the sound of the word bump. And the hobnob, one of my favorite restaurants in Brown County. He invented the word there. Skim milk. Are you serious, bro? And even taking the idea of being alone, Shakespeare coined the idea of lonely. He was born probably 1564, probably April 23rd. We know the year he was born, but we guess on his actual birth date because that's just an estimate based on the record of baptism. They know he was baptized in a church, and it's usually 3 days after the birth date. Stratford upon Avon, these 2 little towns, provinces upon one another in England. Okay, and John and Mary were his parents. He was one of 8 children. We know many famous authors we've studied. They came from a household with many different siblings, competing for attention, using their creativity to outwit their siblings. Will's father apprenticed him to be a butcher at age 13. But little is known about his schooling after his time. Clearly, as a young man, Mr. Will Shakespeare must have worked in many different avenues, disciplines, careers, because he knows so much about all of them and he can write so many different kinds of characters. But we have very few records and 0 letters that he ever wrote. So we don't really know if he had a university education or not. He's one of the smartest people that's ever written down anything. So he must have had an extensive education. Was it a formal education, or did he just have a mentor, an informal education, somebody who taught him? He clearly had access to a good library, but his biography is incomplete. He married Anne Hathaway. Yes, the actor today is named after her. Age 18, they had a daughter, Susanna, and if you look at the timeline, it does seem like the pregnancy occurred before the marriage. Is that why they had to get married? She was only 18 years old. It was pretty common, though, for teenagers to be arranged with their marriages here. This marriage happened pretty quickly, though, and it looks like if you look at the months, Hathaway was already pregnant. They had twins then 2 years after that, Judith and Hamlet. And in 1585, Shakespeare was caught poaching deer. He was banished from Stratford to London. His son Hamlet died in 1596 at age 11, just a couple years before Shakespeare wrote Hamlet. And there is a new book that just came out last year that's called Hamlet. It's by Maggie O'Farrell, and it's pretty interesting because it tells like a fictionalized version of what they think young Hamlet's life was like. All right, it's pretty cool stuff. All right, check that out if you want to read more about it. He married Anne Hathaway, 18. She was 26, a little older than him. And November to May, 9 months pregnancy. You see what I mean? And then Hamlet died at age 11. So you could interpret maybe the grief of having your young child die, of having your only son die, might have provoked a sense of loneliness, grief, or despair in Mr. Will Shakespeare that might have influenced some of his plays. Specifically, a play called Hamlet, where the title of the play is 1 letter away from his dead son. His dead son might not have been too far from his mind. So look at the timeline here. You read in ninth grade Romeo and Juliet. You read Macbeth in 10th grade. Macbeth was actually a more mature play later in his life. Hamlet's kind of right in the sweet spot, though. At his peak, I think this is Shakespeare at his peak, creatively, spiritually, emotionally. 1601, right at the turn of the century, but it was 2 years before Queen Elizabeth dies. They knew she was sick. The queen was old, and they knew she wasn't married. So who was going to succeed her? Okay, we have the very complicated lineage of Queen Elizabeth's family. King James I becomes the king after that, and you might know his name from that KJV, the King James Version of the Bible was named after him. Who was going to succeed? It was a lot of anxiety about the succession of power because Queen Elizabeth wasn't married. They knew this. They knew this before Shakespeare came out with Hamlet. So you'll see this anxiety surrounding the play. Who is going to be the next ruler? That's what starts the beginning of Hamlet. The king is dead, so who will succeed him? That anxiety and that ambiguity is right at the heart of our plot. Elizabeth I, the last of the Tudors. King James I, he was the great-grandson of Margaret Tudor, and he had already been the King of Scotland. Okay. Now, Shakespeare was definitely influenced by the anxious succession of power between these queen and then the next king. And he didn't want to write about a play in England, so he sets Hamlet in the kingdom of Denmark, just nearby Scotland, just nearby England, Denmark. So it's close enough to maybe draw some parallels, but not too close to the vest to make people feel a little bit uncomfortable. You know what I mean? So, comedies, tragedies, histories, there were about 18 different versions and quartos that were pirated and bootlegged during his lifetime because none of the plays were published in Shakespeare's life. It wasn't until after his death that all the plays were published. So that means he really didn't put much emphasis on the publishing of his plays. He wanted to be a published poet. So it's his sonnets. His sonnets are the ones that Shakespeare wanted to be his legacy. The plays he wrote, many critics think they were just a way to pay the bills, but he was so freaking good at it. None of them published in his lifetime, though. That's the Globe Theater, a reconstruction today in the very similar architecture and shape to Shakespeare's time. The physical theater, open air, no ceiling. So it was usually, at Shakespeare's time, with no artificial lighting, plays were occurring during the daytime, and they had to finish before dusk or else it'd be too dark. Today, we have artificial lights. We can sort of illuminate inside the theater. But look at that beautiful, beautiful state. You can imagine as dusk, Venus appears. You can see a couple stars popping out right at the climax of a play. He would have had maybe many of those plays start at maybe 5 p.m. and wrapping up about 7:30 or 8 p.m. as dusk and darkness falls. Okay, this was Entertainment Row. There were lots of theaters around that street. So Shakespeare was commissioned to write his for the Globe, but many other competing theaters, a very competitive environment, which might help us understand how Shakespeare got so good at this, competing against other playwrights of the time. The construction material at the time was wood, though. It was open air, and that created, with all the people attending, all the different balconies and seats, that it was a sense of maybe dangerous. The stage jutted out right in the middle, and they had a tiring house where you would retire the backstage area after you were on stage. You retire and maybe do a costume change and rehydrate. The balcony was usually considered for the upper class people, including the queen herself, Queen Elizabeth. So she would be kept away from the action down front and away from some of the lower class people that couldn't afford a seat. The standing groundlings, they were the one that leaned on the stage. They get a penny. It just cost a penny to be there right against the stage. And they could get a good seat. It's not the nosebleed section for these people. They find one penny, one little farthing, they get right up front. And the phrase break a leg came from the groundlings who would be watching someone perform. To be or not to be, that is the question. And they'd lean on the stage. They're leaning against the stage here because they didn't have a seat. So 3 hours go by, they're starting to get tired. They're leaning on the stage, and sometimes they've been eating all the different pistachios and all the different pecans. They're eating these nuts. They didn't have popcorn then, but they were eating a lot of pistachios, and they're throwing the shells away, and they get really dehydrated, and they start drooling, and those groundlings would be drooling on the stage. So if an actor was so good at their job, if an actor did such an amazing job at it, the groundlings' drool would pool. A pool of drool on the stage, and the actor in the middle of their set might be to be or not to be. That is the question. They might fall and break their leg. So that's why you tell an actor, break a leg. It means they're so good, they're going to slip on that pool of drool. The wood material that they used, it burned in 1613 during Henry VIII. A Shakespearean play. The construction material was that timber wood. A theatrical cannon they used was set off, but it misfired, igniting the wooden beams and thatchings below it. No one was hurt except a man whose burning breeches were put out with a bottle of ale. So the Chamberlain's men, the King's men, this was the group that was commissioned to be in Shakespeare's plays. And he had like a core group of people that acted in many of his plays. They were all men because at the time they would only have prepubescent boys play many of the female parts because the prepubescent boys, their voices hadn't dropped. You know what I mean? It hadn't dropped. Okay, anyway. There were no playbills. They didn't get extra information or pamphlets when they came in. It was continuous action throughout. They didn't like to have long interludes or long intermissions. Just keep it moving. The gender roles, like I said, all male actors. There was no front curtain, so they didn't hide the stage in between scenes. There was little to no scenery, though, so they didn't have too many scene changes. That's why Shakespeare... Hey, what's going on? Yeah, I was just recording a video here. There's that paper I told you about.
Thank you.
Uh-huh. So that's why Mr. Shakespeare put so much emphasis on the descriptive language in his plays, because they didn't have too much scenery to build the setting and the atmosphere. The language helped build that atmosphere. They had very elaborate costumes to help with that, though. And some other poetic elements, the doctrine of decorum. You were supposed to act honorable. You were supposed to portray your plays and stories in a sense of nobility. Because even though they invited lower class people into the stage, they were trying to maintain a sense of decorum. So otherwise, if the play was too bawdy or too pornographic, they would shut it down. This was a style appropriate to the subject, situation, speaker, and audience, and it elevated the themes of these types of stories. According to Roman philosopher and the artist Cicero, the grand and important themes should be treated in a dignified and noble style. So this is how the themes were treated. A humble or trivial theme in a less exalted or less dignified manner, not as significant. They also spoke in iambic pentameter, so they had many different couplets, which emphasized the noble speech. They had, that means the first syllable of each line is not accented, and the second syllable is accented. So, unstressed, stressed, unstressed, stressed, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. 5 penta, 5 of those couplet or feet, 5 of those feet in each line. It was blank verse, so that means they did not always have a regular rhyme scheme. Shakespeare kind of goes in and out of rhyme scheme. The blank verse means the rhyme scheme is blank and sort of up to the writer to determine. And when they had prose, that was usually characters who were not noble. So lower class characters, or sometimes younger characters, they spoke without any sense of pentameter or prose. So it sounds more like something you would just read out of a normal book or normal conversation. But upper class characters would definitely use that iambic pentameter, very rigid syllables. The humors with the U, that British spelling, was a very common medical philosophy of the time. There were 4 liquids that influenced people's temperament and personality. The blood influenced how light-hearted you were in your personality. The phlegm in your body influenced how dull and kind you were. Yellow bile produced by the spleen or the liver would make you more irritable if it was not at the right balance. And the black bile produced sometimes by the liver, because they thought the liver was the most important organ. It is the biggest organ down there. They didn't quite have the medical knowledge that we have today. The black bile, if it was too unbalanced, would create melancholy, meaning deep sadness. These are the bodily fluids, humors. You'll hear them mentioned several times throughout the play. So just keep an eye on how that influences if someone is stable or if a character is unstable. The humors will be mentioned. You can pause the video here and look at some more of those. So as we wrap up here, the sonnets are the other thing we'll be studying while we read Hamlet. Okay, Shakespeare's sonnets written in the iambic pentameter. We can check page 8 of our Poetic Devices glossary we used with the poem bank to check more deeply into that. It's 14 lines, and the final 2 lines, that final couplet, are usually indented, and they give a synthesizing theme. So that's one thing we'll look for in Shakespeare's sonnets. Okay, we'll study those in tandem with the play. Quatrains are lines of 4, quattro. So if a couplet is 2, you'll see 3 quatrains, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then lines 5, 6, 7, 8, and then lines 9, 10, 11, 12. Quatrain, 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 and then we end in a final synthesizing couplet that synthesizes the theme. That's the form that Shakespeare was working with, and he influenced so many other poets that came after him. So we call that the Shakespearean sonnet. These are the different sonnet forms. I'm going to end the video here as you look over them. And you got your yellow book. Bring it to class. Shakespeare's Hamlet. I'm super excited to read it with you. This is Mr. Spencer signing off.